They say Dina doesn't lie. But what it reveals can shatter a family faster than any secret whispered behind closed doors. Imagine a tense dinner, where a wife laughs with relief as a paternity test confirms her son is the legitimate heir. Her smile freezes when the report lists a second genetic match, not her husband's brother or cousin, but the elderly gardener who's been tending the estate for years. The truth buried in that soil runs deeper than anyone imagined. This is the story of George and Eleanor Hadley, whose marriage was already splintering under the weight of suspicion. George, a man who built a fortune from nothing, demanded a paternity test to silence the whispers that his only son, Charles, was not his own. The test came back. Eleanor laughed, vindicated. Charles was legitimate. But the lab technician had made a note at the bottom of the page, a second name flagged by the system. A match so close it couldn't be ignored. It belonged to the man who had been pruning their hedges for 11 years, a quiet, gentle gardener named Samuel. The question that hung in the air that night wasn't just who Samuel really was. It was why George's face had gone as pale as the sheets his mother gave birth on 43 years ago. The name on that report was Samuel Beckett, the gardener. The man who had spent 11 years pruning Eleanor's roses, mulching the east garden, and nodding politely at a family that barely registered his existence. The same man Charles had once described as the help who talks to plants more than people. And now the lab's genetic algorithm had flagged Samuel as a sibling match to Charles. Not a distant cousin, not a possible uncle, a half-brother. George's face didn't just lose color. It went slack in the particular way that only a man confronting a ghost he'd been running from for 43 years can experience. Eleanor saw it. That righteous vindication she'd felt 60 seconds earlier evaporated into something cold and unfamiliar. She had spent 2 years being accused of infidelity, of passing off another man's child as George's heir. The test cleared her, but it didn't clear George. "Who is Samuel?" Eleanor asked. Her voice was level, but it was the levelness of a woman holding a grenade and waiting to hear why the pin was already pulled. George didn't answer. He just stared at that second line on the report, the one that read, "Direct sibling correlation confirmed. Probability of shared parent, 99.97%. Charles was already out of his chair. "This is insane," he said. "The gardener? The man doesn't even have a birth certificate on file here. He's probably here on a forged visa. This is a scam. He probably paid off the lab." Nobody believed that, not even Charles. But when you're the golden child who just discovered you're not the only heir, your brain reaches for the nearest exit, even if that exit leads straight off a cliff. Eleanor looked from her husband to her son and back again, and then she did something none of them expected. She laughed. Not the relieved laugh from moments earlier. This one was hollow and knowing and deeply, dangerously exhausted. "Oh, George," she said, "tell me he isn't yours. Tell me you didn't hire your own son to prune our hedges without ever telling him who he really was." George's jaw tightened. Everything about him, the custom suit, the corner office in his own firm, the carefully cultivated authority, suddenly looked like set dressing on a stage that was collapsing. He pushed his chair back, stood up, and walked to the window. The backyard was dark now, but they could all see the outline of the greenhouse where Samuel spent most mornings coaxing orchids into bloom. "I didn't know," George said finally. His voice was stripped raw, the voice of a 72-year-old man who had built a fortress out of money and secrets and just felt the foundation crack. "I swear to you, Eleanor, I didn't know." But he hadn't said, "He isn't mine." Eleanor caught that immediately. She had spent 30 years married to a man who negotiated multi-million-dollar deals with a poker face made of granite, and she knew a evasion when it sat down across the dinner table from her. "When?" she asked. "Before us? During?" "George, I need to know everything, now." And that is where this story leaves the territory of dinner party scandal and enters something far more complicated. Because what was about to be unearthed wasn't just an affair. It was a decision made by a young man in the summer of 1981, a decision that rippled outward through decades, shaping lives he never even knew existed, until the day his own son applied for a job tending his garden, and neither one of them recognized the other. Let me take you back to that summer. George Hadley was 29 years old, the son of a textile worker, 2 years out of business school, burning with ambition and completely broke in the way that makes you either relentless or invisible. He had landed a temporary job at a textile mill in Millbrook, a small town about 90 miles from the city. That mill wasn't just a job. It was his thesis project. He was studying how small manufacturers managed supply chains, gathering data for a dissertation that would later become the blueprint for his entire company. In Millbrook, he met a woman named Clara Driscoll. She was 23, sharp, gentle, the daughter of a local farmer. She worked in the mill's front office, processing invoices. George used to say that Clara could spot a math error at 20 paces. He was there for 6 months, and in that time, they fell into the kind of quiet, uncomplicated love that young people mistake for forever. When the research project ended, George went back to the city with a notebook full of data and a promise to Clara that he'd return in a few weeks, once he presented his findings and sorted out his next steps. Those weeks turned into months. He was offered a junior position at a consulting firm. The salary was modest, but the doors it opened were not. He got busy. He got ambitious. The letters from Clara arrived less and less frequently, until eventually they stopped entirely. He told himself she'd moved on. He told himself she probably hadn't been serious anyway. He told himself the lies that let him sleep at night. What he didn't know, what he would not learn for more than 4 decades, was that Clara was pregnant when he left. She tried to reach him. Letters came back marked no longer at this address. He had moved apartments without forwarding mail. Phones were for people with money, and Clara didn't have one. She gave birth to a son in February of 1982. She named him Samuel, after her father. She raised him alone in a one-room cottage on the edge of a farm that had seen better days. Samuel grew up quiet and observant, learning to work the soil because it was the only thing that never disappointed him. Now here's where the story gets strange in a way that even I have trouble accepting. And if I weren't looking at the property records and employment forms myself, I'd tell you this was fiction. 11 years ago, the Hadleys bought a country estate in the same county where Clara had once lived. They wanted a weekend home, something with land. George hired a landscaping service to maintain the grounds. The man driving the truck that first morning was Samuel. He'd become a gardener, not by calling exactly, but because it was a skill he'd learned young, and it kept him outside. And after his mother died of cancer 8 years earlier, he preferred the company of plants to people. The company sent him to the Hadley estate. George walked out that first morning, shook Samuel's hand, asked if he knew anything about rose bushes. Samuel said he did. George said, "Good, they've been dying since we got here." That was the extent of their interaction. Neither man felt anything, because neither man knew there was anything to feel. For 11 years, Samuel tended that garden. He pruned the hedges that Eleanor admired at her luncheons. He planted the tulips that guests complimented at parties. He stood politely in the background, while Charles, who was 17 when Samuel arrived, grew into an entitled 28-year-old who barely acknowledged the man holding the shears. And in all that time, through all those years of breathing the same air and walking the same grounds, neither father nor son recognized what was right in front of them. The paternity test changed everything. But how it changed things, that's where this story takes a turn even George didn't see coming. The night after the revelation, Charles didn't sleep. He paced his wing of the house, replaying every interaction he'd ever had with Samuel. The gardener who never complained. The gardener who worked silently while Charles barked orders about the hedges being too tall or the mulch smelling too strong. The gardener who, Charles now realized, had the same jawline as the man sitting at the head of the dinner table. Panic does strange things to a man who has been told his entire life that he is the center of the universe. Charles wasn't just facing a half-brother. He was facing a half-brother who had done nothing but humble, honest work while Charles had spent his 20s attending private universities on his father's dime, vacationing in Europe, and preening for a corner office he'd never truly earned. The contrast was unbearable, and in that unbearable heat, a plan began to form. The next morning, before anyone else was awake, Charles went to the greenhouse. Samuel was already there, repotting seedlings under the faint glow of a grow light. He looked up, unsurprised. 11 years of service had taught him to expect almost anything from the Hadley family, including early morning visits that never spelled good news. "Mr. Charles," Samuel said. His voice was even, unreadable. Charles didn't waste time. "I'm going to make this simple," he said. "There's a document circulating that suggests a biological connection between you and my father. I don't know how you engineered this, whether you got to the lab or someone's feeding you information, but it ends today. You will resign, effective immediately. You will leave this property and never return. In exchange, I'll make a one-time payment to you of $200,000, wired before close of business. It's more than you'd earn in a decade. You take it, you disappear, and we never speak of this again." Samuel set down the seedling tray. He wiped his hands on a rag that had seen better years. And then he looked at Charles with eyes that had spent a lifetime learning to read the weather, and he said, "Mr. Charles, I've been working on this property since I was 32 years old. I don't know what documents you're talking about, and I don't know why you think I have some connection to your family. I'm just a gardener. If you want me gone, you don't have to pay me. Write my final check, and I'll be off the property by noon." Charles didn't believe him, not because Samuel was lying, but because Charles, at his core, couldn't conceive of a man who wouldn't leap at money. "You're saying you don't know what I'm talking about." "I'm saying," Samuel said evenly, "that if there's something you think I've done, you've got the wrong man. I don't scheme, I don't plot. I plant things and I watch them grow." Charles stood there vibrating with a fury that had no target. He'd come ready to negotiate with a con man, and instead he found a man who genuinely didn't know. That was worse, because it meant the secret wasn't a scheme. It was real. Eleanor, meanwhile, had done her own digging. She hadn't slept either. She'd spent the night in George's study, going through boxes of old documents, property acquisitions, anything that might explain how this gardener had appeared in their lives. What she found was a stack of letters, unopened, tied with a faded blue ribbon, hidden behind a row of legal textbooks on a shelf George never touched. They were addressed to him at an old city address. The handwriting was neat and feminine. The postmarks were from Millbrook, dated 1981 through 1983. Eleanor didn't open them right away. She sat in George's leather chair, holding a bundle of another woman's unsent words, and for the first time in her marriage, she felt something toward her husband that wasn't anger or resentment or even disappointment. It was pity, because whatever was in those letters, George had never seen them. He'd never known. And now a man with his eyes and his quiet patience was standing in their greenhouse, fatherless for 43 years. She carried the letters downstairs, just as Charles stormed back from the greenhouse, his face a mess of thwarted fury. George was at the kitchen table, looking like he hadn't moved in hours. He didn't know, Charles said, almost accusatorially, as if Samuel's ignorance were a personal affront. The gardener has no idea he's your son. George looked up, and the weight of 43 years of denial settled into the lines around his mouth. Then someone needs to tell him, he said. And that someone has to be me. Eleanor placed the bundle of letters on the table. These might help explain it, she said. They're from his mother. You might want to read them first. George looked at the ribbon, at the handwriting he hadn't seen since he was 29 years old, and too scared to face what he'd left behind. He reached for the top letter, and his hand, the hand of a man who had built an empire, trembled. What he read in those letters didn't just change him. It broke open a door that had been sealed since the moment he drove out of Millbrook, and on the other side of it was a son who had spent his entire life believing his father was a ghost who had never wanted him. Samuel wasn't just George's secret. He was the living consequence of a choice George had been running from before he even knew there was a choice to make. And now that door was open, and everything the Hadley family thought it knew about loyalty, inheritance, and the meaning of rightful belonging was about to be tested in a way no one at that table was prepared for. The greenhouse smelled of damp soil and rosemary. George Hadley, founder of Hadley Textiles, worth a conservative $140 million, stood in the doorway and watched the son he'd never known repotting lavender. Samuel didn't turn around. He had a gardener's radar for presence, the way plants sense a shift in barometric pressure. "Mr. Hadley," Samuel said, still working the soil. "Your son was here earlier." "I know." George's voice caught. He cleared his throat. "He's not the only son who needs to speak with you this morning." Samuel's hands stopped. He set the trowel down, wiped his palms, and finally turned. He looked at George with the same steady patience he'd given the roses for 11 years. "What did you say?" George didn't repeat it. Instead, he pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket, the Dina report, and handed it over. Samuel read it. He read it twice. The greenhouse fan hummed. A ladybug crawled across the rim of a terracotta pot. When Samuel looked up again, his eyes weren't wet. They were clear and terribly calm, like a pond before a stone breaks the surface. "This says my father is you. Yes, I've been working here 11 years. Yes, you never knew." "No." George stepped forward, then stopped, unsure whether he had the right. "There are letters. Your mother wrote them. I never saw them until this morning. Clara, she tried to find me. I'd moved. I didn't leave a forwarding address. I was 29 and careless, and I didn't know you existed." Samuel set the report down on the workbench. He didn't shout. He didn't cry. He did something far more unsettling. He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he's just been handed the final piece of a puzzle that had been missing his entire life. "I used to imagine what my father looked like," Samuel said quietly. "When I was 7, I drew a picture of him. Tall, I figured. Maybe a man who traveled. I gave him a suitcase and a hat. My mother kept it on the wall until the day she died. She never said a cruel word about him. She told me he was a student studying supply chains, that he came from the city, that he was smart and kind, and probably just lost. I thought that was the saddest way to describe a father." Lost, George's throat closed. He was 72 and had negotiated hostile takeovers without breaking composure. But those words undid him. "I can't fix the past," he said, "but I can tell you the truth now, and I can promise you this. You're not invisible anymore." Something flickered in Samuel's face. Not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition. And recognition is the first cousin of hope. Meanwhile, in the main house, Charles was doing exactly what a cornered heir does when the walls start closing in. He made phone calls. The first was to the Hadley family attorney, Richard Fenn, a man who'd been handling their legal affairs for 25 years. Charles explained the situation in clipped, frantic sentences. Richard listened, then said something that made Charles go completely still. "Listen to me carefully, Charles. If Samuel is legally established as George's biological son, and if George's will has not explicitly excluded him, there is a very real possibility that Samuel could claim a portion of the estate. Some jurisdictions allow posthumously discovered children to contest. In your father's case, if the will was drafted without knowledge of Samuel, a probate court could find grounds to invalidate its current structure. That's not guaranteed, but it's a fight. And fights cost everyone." Charles hung up and stared at his phone. The math was suddenly terrifying. He'd spent his entire adult life banking on the assumption that Hadley Textiles, the estate, the investments, the whole kingdom would filter down to him alone. Now a man with dirt under his fingernails was about to walk into probate court with a DINA test and 43 years of quiet dignity. He had to act. And if there's one thing Charles had learned from his father, it was that problems could be solved with the right pressure. He went back to his study, opened his safe, and removed a stack of documents: Samuel's employment records, his visa application, the background check from 11 years ago. If he couldn't pay Samuel off, he'd discredit him. The visa had expired 2 years ago. Samuel had applied for renewal, but the paperwork was delayed. Technically, he was here illegally. Charles allowed himself a thin smile. But when he brought this to his parents an hour later, Eleanor didn't smile back. "You're going to threaten him with deportation?" she said, her voice cold as a scalpel. "The man who has pruned my roses since you were 17? The man who never missed a day, never asked for a raise, never complained when you treated him like furniture? You're going to use his immigration status against him because you're scared he might take something you think you're owed?" "He's an illegal," Charles said. "The law is the law." Eleanor stood up. For the first time in their relationship, Charles saw something in his mother's eyes that looked less like maternal love and more like the steel that had been forged during 30 years of marriage to a man who'd kept secrets. "The law," she said, "is about to acknowledge that Samuel is your father's son. And I will not stand by while you try to weaponize paperwork to erase him." George, who had been silent at the kitchen table, finally spoke. "Sit down, Charles. We're not deporting your brother." "Brother?" Charles spat the word. "You're just going to accept this? He could be anyone. DINA tests can be wrong. He could have tampered with it. He's probably been planning this for years." "Charles," George's voice was quiet but absolute, "I read your mother's letters. I read them all. Clara Driscoll didn't scheme. She was a girl who loved me, and I forgot her. I forgot her, and she raised a son alone in a one-room cottage while I was building a company. The least I owe Samuel is the truth and a chance to know his father. So you're going to sit down, and you're going to stop trying to destroy a man who has done nothing but exist." Charles didn't sit. He stormed out, but as he passed the hallway window, he saw Samuel walking back toward the greenhouse, his silhouette framed by the morning light. There was a quiet dignity in his stride that Charles had never noticed before. It was, he realized with a sick lurch, exactly how George walked. Not the boardroom George, but the George who walked the garden in the evenings, hands in pockets, thinking, the same gait, the same tilt of the head. Charles had seen it 1,000 times and never once recognized it, because he'd never looked. That was the moment the fight changed. Charles had always believed he was the heir because blood meant continuity. But blood, it turned out, wasn't only running through his veins. It was walking around in the man who knew how deep to plant tulip bulbs so they'd bloom in April. The man who could predict rainfall by the way the clover closed its leaves. And here's the part Charles wasn't prepared for. Eleanor had been watching Samuel too, not with resentment, but with a strange, exhausted tenderness that ran deeper than obligation. Later that day, she walked to the greenhouse alone. Samuel was securing a loose trellis. She stood beside him, and for a long moment, neither spoke. "You know, the roses were dying when we bought this place," she said finally. "The gardener we had before you said the soil was too acidic. He wanted to tear them all out. George said no. And then you arrived, and you added 1 handful of lime to each bush, and within 6 months, they were the envy of the county. I never forgot that." Samuel tied off a vine. "Roses just need the right balance, Mrs. Hadley. They're not complicated. My husband owes you more than an apology," she said. "He owes you 43 years. I can't give you those back. But I want you to know that in this house, in this family, you are not a problem to be solved. Whatever comes next, you have a place here." Samuel looked at her. He was not a man accustomed to tenderness from employers. He'd learned long ago that the wealthy offer kindness the way they offer hors d'oeuvres, small, decorative, and rarely meant to satisfy. But Eleanor's eyes held something real. "I don't want his money," Samuel said. "I never did. I just wanted to know if he would have stayed. If he'd known. That's the question I've carried since I was old enough to understand I had no father." Eleanor reached out and touched his arm. "My husband didn't stay because he was afraid, and he spent his whole life pretending his fear was ambition. That doesn't excuse it. But I've lived with the man for 30 years, and I can tell you this, the person he was at 29 is not the person he is right now. And the reason he's been standing at that window for the last hour is because he knows he can't undo the damage, but he might finally be brave enough to face it." That night, George called a family meeting, not in the formal dining room, but in the kitchen. He insisted Samuel join them. Charles sat rigid as granite, Eleanor stood by the stove, and Samuel sat at the table where he'd never been invited to sit before, his work boots still dusty from the garden. George placed the bundle of letters on the table. He'd sorted them by date. The earliest was postmarked September 1981, 3 months after he left Millbrook. "I'm going to read you something," George said. He opened the first letter. His voice trembled, but he read it straight. "George, I don't know where you've gone. I've written to the old address 3 times and they've come back. I'm not angry. I just need to tell you that I'm pregnant. I know this complicates everything. I know you have your career and your plans. But this child is real, and I'm going to keep him, and I wanted you to know. If you want to come back, the door is open. If you don't, I'll manage. I always have. But please, just write me 1 line. I just need to know you received this." George stopped. The kitchen was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Samuel was staring at the table, his jaw tight. "It goes on," George said. "There are 14 more. She wrote until July of 1983. By then, she'd stopped asking me to come back. She was just writing to tell me about you, Samuel, your first steps. Your first word, which was tractor. Your love of earthworms. She said you'd spend hours digging in the garden, talking to the soil like it could hear you. Samuel's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. She never stopped talking about you. Even when the letters came back, even when she was sick near the end. She told me you were probably out there somewhere, wondering. She made excuses for you. She was good at that. I don't deserve those excuses, George said. I don't deserve her grace. But I'm asking you, not for forgiveness I haven't earned, but for a chance to know you. Properly, starting now. Charles slammed his hand on the table. This is absurd. You're all sitting here weeping over love letters from 40 years ago, while I'm supposed to just accept that my father has a secret gardener's son who might waltz into our lives and claim half of everything I've been raised to inherit? No, I won't allow it. George turned to him. You won't allow it? You heard me. Charles stood. You built this company. You built this life. And yes, I'm your son. But I'm the one who's been sitting in board meetings with you, learning the business, doing everything you asked. Samuel has been pulling weeds. He doesn't understand what's at stake. He doesn't know the first thing about running Hadley Textiles. You think your shareholders want to see a gardener inherit a seat at the table? That's not your decision to make, George said. And I'm starting to think your version of protecting the company looks a lot like protecting your own comfort. Charles laughed, bitter and jagged. You're going to lecture me about comfort? You, who covered up a secret for 43 years. You, who let the truth sit buried in a box of unopened mail while you built your empire. Don't pretend you're taking the moral high ground now. The room went cold. Eleanor put a hand on the counter to steady herself. And Samuel, who had been silent through the explosion, finally spoke. Stop! Everyone turned. Samuel looked at Charles with the same steady gaze he used when examining a sick plant. He wasn't angry. He wasn't intimidated. He was simply paying attention. I don't want your inheritance, Samuel said. I don't want your company. I don't want a seat at your table or your father's money. I came here 11 years ago to work in a garden, and I've done that work honestly every day since. If your father wants to know me, that's between him and me. But I'm not here to take anything from you. The only thing I've ever wanted, from a father I never met, was to be seen. And I think that scares you more than money ever could. Charles opened his mouth, but no words came. Because what do you say when the man you've dismissed as the help turns out to be the one person in the room unafraid of your tantrums? George looked at his two sons, one standing, fists clenched, face twisted with entitlement, the other sitting quietly, work-worn hands folded, asking for nothing. And in that moment, the question at the heart of this entire story became terrifyingly clear. Charles had all the privileges of fatherhood, all the boarding schools, the trust fund, the boardroom grooming. But what did he actually inherit of George's character? Samuel, raised in poverty by a dying mother who never stopped believing in a man who had forgotten her, had somehow grown into the one thing George had always hoped his heir would be: humble, steady, and honest. The Dina report had revealed a biological truth. But the far more dangerous revelation was still unfolding. Because the son George had never known wasn't just related by blood. He was the son who reflected the best of who George had once been, before ambition replaced conscience. And Charles, who had spent his life being told he was the natural successor, was moments away from discovering that inheritance isn't about blood. It's about becoming the kind of person your father would actually choose to leave something to. The week that followed was a pressure cooker. Charles hired a private investigator to dig into Samuel's background, searching for anything that could be weaponized. The Pie found nothing but a history of quiet, unremarkable labor. He'd worked nurseries, farms, a brief stint at a botanical garden. No criminal record, no hidden debts. He volunteered at a community garden on weekends. He sent money anonymously to a children's hospital every Christmas. The report read like a character reference for a saint, which infuriated Charles more than any scandal could have. Meanwhile, the family's attorney quietly began reviewing the estate plan. George had drafted his will 15 years ago, leaving everything to Eleanor and, upon her passing, to Charles. Samuel's existence complicated that plan in ways no one had anticipated. Not because Samuel was demanding anything, he hadn't asked for a penny, but because George was now insisting on rewriting the will to include him. Not to exclude Charles, but to create a structure that acknowledged both sons. Charles saw this as betrayal. He threatened a legal challenge. He accused Samuel of orchestrating the entire thing. He told his mother that if she sided with George, he'd sever contact and stop bringing her grandchildren, whom he didn't yet have, but wielded like a phantom weapon. Eleanor, exhausted but immovable, told him to stop posturing and start acting like a man. Then came the night of the fire. George had kept the stack of Clara's letters on his desk. Charles, in a final act of desperation, crept into the study while the household slept. He took the letters, and he took the Dina report, and he carried them to the outdoor fire pit near the garden. He doused them with lighter fluid and struck a match. Samuel, who often walked the grounds at night because he'd never quite adjusted to sleeping indoors after years of the gardener's cottage, saw the flames from the greenhouse. He arrived just as the first letter was curling into ash. "Those aren't yours to burn," Samuel said. Charles spun around, the fire casting wild shadows on his face. "These letters have ruined my life. They've ruined my inheritance. They're nothing but the desperate fantasies of a woman who should have moved on." Samuel stepped closer. The flames flickered between them. "My mother wrote those words." "You have no right." "I have every right," Charles said. "I'm protecting my family." "Your family?" Samuel's voice was still calm, but there was iron underneath. "Your family has been keeping me hidden like a weed in a flower bed. I've been here 11 years, Charles. I've watched you treat your employees like servants, your mother like an inconvenience, and your father like an obstacle between you and his wallet. You talk about inheritance like it's a birthright, but all I've seen you inherit is his ability to run from the truth." Charles lunged, not with his fists, but with a laugh, sharp and dismissive. "You're a gardener. You'll always be a gardener. I'm the one who was raised to run an empire. You can't compete with that." "I'm not competing," Samuel said. "That's the difference. You've been running a race your whole life without realizing there's nobody on the track but you." The fire died down. The letters were gone, except one that Samuel had grabbed from the edge of the flames. It was the last letter Clara had written, dated July 1983. George had read it only once. Samuel unfolded it, the edges singed, and looked at his mother's handwriting for the first time in decades. "My dear George," it read, in fading ink, "if you ever find your way here, or someone tells you about a boy named Samuel, please know he's good. He's the best thing I ever did. He'd make you proud. I've stopped asking for things. I just want you to know that." Samuel folded the letter and tucked it into his shirt pocket. He looked at Charles one last time. "You can burn the paper. You can hire lawyers. You can try to erase me from every document in this estate. But you can't burn what your father already knows. And you can't compete with a ghost you made yourself." He walked back toward the greenhouse, leaving Charles standing in the dark, smoke rising from what was left of the past. The next morning, George found the fire pit. He didn't need to ask what happened. He saw the scorched edges of paper and understood. He walked to the greenhouse and found Samuel at the workbench, the singed letter propped against a pot of mint. George sat down on a wooden crate beside his son. They didn't speak for a long while. The only sound was the morning birds and the drip of water from the irrigation line. "I can't get those years back," George said finally, "but I can make sure the years I have left count. I'm changing the will, Samuel, not because anyone is forcing me, but because I've spent too long pretending that legacy is just about money. It's about who you leave it to. And I want you to have a place in this family that doesn't require you to be anyone but who you are." Samuel finally turned. "And if I don't want the money, then it'll sit there anyway. But I think there's something you do want." Samuel waited. "You've been growing things in this garden for 11 years, George said. What if it were yours? Not just to tend, but to own. The land, the greenhouses. I bought this estate from the county. But I didn't know until this week that the original parcel included 40 acres that once belonged to your mother's family. The Driscoll plot. I own it. The deed's in my name. If you want it, it's yours, not as a gift from a guilty father, as what should have been yours all along." For the first time, Samuel's composure cracked. Just a bit. A tear traced a clean line through the soil dust on his cheek. His mother's land. The field she'd grown up running through. The soil that had fed her family for generations before poverty and circumstance forced her to work in a mill. George was offering him not just money, but return. Restoration, that was the turning point. Not the paternity test. Not the letters. Not the fight with Charles. It was the moment George acknowledged that his son's inheritance was never about him at all. It was about Clara, and the land she had lost, and the son she'd raised alone, while George built a fortune on an industry the Driscoll family had helped sustain with their labor. The world was about to see what happened when the quiet gardener, the one everyone overlooked, finally claimed his ground. It took 6 weeks for the legal paperwork to catch up to the promises George Hadley had made in that greenhouse. The transfer of the Driscoll parcel, 40 acres of rolling field and old growth oak that had once belonged to Clara's grandfather, was simple on paper but seismic in meaning. Samuel signed the deed acceptance with the same hand that had pruned 1,000 roses, and George watched him do it with the expression of a man who had spent 43 years writing checks and had finally found one that mattered. Richard Fenn, the family attorney, had initially advised against it. Not because the transfer was illegal, but because Charles had retained his own attorney and was threatening a protracted probate challenge. George overruled him. "This isn't a negotiation," he said. "This is a correction." Charles didn't take the news well. He holed up in his city apartment, refused calls, and sent a single text message to his mother: "You chose a stranger over your own son." Eleanor didn't reply. Instead, she drove to the estate the following morning, walked into the greenhouse where Samuel was already at work, and asked him to teach her how to deadhead roses. Samuel, baffled but patient, handed her a pair of shears and spent an hour showing her how to cut just above the leaf bud at a 45-degree angle. It was the most peaceful hour Eleanor had experienced in years, and it was also the moment she fully understood that Samuel's gift wasn't just gardening. It was the unhurried, uncomplaining decency her husband had abandoned decades ago and was only now struggling to recover. But the thing nobody expected, the detail that recontextualized everything, came 4 days later when Samuel was cleaning out the old tool shed at the far edge of the property. The shed had been locked when the Hadleys bought the estate, and no one had ever bothered to force the rusted padlock. Samuel, always practical, cut it off with bolt cutters and stepped inside. The air smelled of dust and old linseed oil. In a corner, beneath a canvas tarp, he found a small wooden trunk with the initials CD burned into the lid. Clara Driscoll. Inside were not letters to George, but letters Clara had written to herself, a journal, spanning the years 1982 to 1995, the year before her cancer diagnosis. Samuel sat on the dusty floor of that shed and read his mother's handwriting as morning light filtered through the cracked window. She wrote about the early years of scraping together money from odd jobs, about Samuel's first bee sting, about the night she saw George's photograph in a business magazine and cried not from sorrow, but from an exhausted, distant pride. And then, on a page dated March 19th, 1987, she wrote something that made Samuel's heart stop. I drove past the house today, the big one on the hill they call Hadley House. I didn't plan to. I was delivering vegetables to a farm stand 2 towns over, and I took the long way back. I saw him in the garden, George. He was walking with a woman, very beautiful, and a little boy, maybe 5 years old. The boy had his walk. I froze. I wanted to run, but I just watched. I thought, he looks happy, and that hurt more than anything. I've decided I will never approach him. I will never tell him about Samuel, not because I'm ashamed, but because I don't want to be the woman who shows up at the door with a child and a demand. That's not who I am. That's not who I want Samuel to become. So I'm writing this here, and I'll lock it away. If fate wants our son to know his father, it will have to find a way without me. Samuel sat in silence. His mother had known. All those years, she had known where George lived, and she had chosen silence out of a fierce, almost unbelievable dignity. She hadn't burned with revenge. She had planted her son in her own soil and trusted that the universe would do the rest. And 11 years before George ever opened a DINA report, fate had delivered Samuel to the very garden where she'd once watched her lost love walk with another woman. It was a symmetry so precise, it felt like mathematics. He closed the journal, tucked it under his arm, and walked straight to the main house. George was in his study, going over the revised will with Fen. Samuel knocked, entered, and placed the open journal on the desk. She knew, he said. She knew you lived here. She came here once and saw you with Eleanor and Charles, and she decided to say nothing. George read the passage. The pen in his hand slipped, rolled off the desk, and clattered on the floor. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then he said, very quietly, she was a better person than I ever was. Samuel didn't disagree. But he also didn't say it to wound. He said it because the truth, finally, deserved to be acknowledged. The woman who had been forgotten had not only forgiven, she had actively protected the family that didn't know she existed. That revelation shifted something in Eleanor, too. She'd been quietly supportive, but the journal entry dissolved any remaining trace of resentment. You cannot compete with a woman who chose your family's peace over her own justice. Eleanor asked Samuel for a photograph of Clara. He had only one, a faded Polaroid of her standing beside a row of tomato plants. Laughing, Eleanor framed it and placed it on the mantel in the main living room, right beside the photograph of her own mother. It was, she told Samuel, the only way she could think of to welcome Clara into the house she'd chosen never to enter. Charles, meanwhile, had not softened. 3 weeks after the will was amended, he served his father with a formal contestation. The grounds were duress, emotional manipulation, and Samuel's immigration status. The filing was aggressive, publicly filed, and designed to humiliate. It backfired disastrously. The judge, upon seeing the DINA evidence and Samuel's clean history, dismissed the challenge in a preliminary hearing. Worse for Charles, the judge mentioned in open court that the plaintiff appeared to be acting out of entitled desperation rather than legitimate legal grievance. The news of that comment leaked to a financial gossip blog, and for a week, Charles was the subject of quiet snickering at the clubs where he had once preened. It was the first time in his life that his name, Hadley, was not a shield. He showed up at the estate unannounced on a Sunday afternoon, not to apologize, but to retrieve some personal items from his wing. Samuel was on the veranda, transplanting seedlings into pots for the autumn display. They hadn't spoken directly since the night of the fire. Charles stopped, and Samuel looked up. "You look tired," Samuel said. It wasn't a jab. It was observation. Charles opened his mouth to deliver something cutting, but the words didn't form. He'd spent weeks rehearsing arguments in his head, accusing Samuel of manipulation, of being a long game con artist who'd orchestrated this from the moment he was hired. But the journal entry had made that impossible. You can't accuse a man of scheming when his mother had intentionally buried the secret decades before he was employed. "I read what she wrote," Charles said finally, his voice clipped. "Your mother." "The journal." Samuel nodded, repotting a fern. "She really just let him go, didn't she? She knew where he was, and she let him go. She believed some things are more important than being right," Samuel said. "I think that's what the word grace means. I'm still learning it." Charles stood there, his expensive shoes on the weathered decking, and for the first time, he didn't have a retort. He'd been raised to argue, to negotiate, to litigate. But grace was not a currency his world traded in. He walked past Samuel into the house without another word, but something in his posture had already begun to buckle. The months that followed were a slow, uneven march toward a new normal. Samuel declined the invitation to sit on the board of Hadley Textiles. He didn't want the company, and no amount of persuasion could change his mind. Instead, he used the Driscoll land to found a horticultural therapy program for at-risk youth. He called it Clara's Acre, and it quietly grew into one of the most respected small nonprofits in the county. George visited every week, not as a benefactor, but as a volunteer. He dug holes for saplings, laid mulch, and was bossed around by teenagers who had no idea he was worth 9 figures. He loved every minute of it. Eleanor became the organization's most enthusiastic donor, but she also learned to prune. She'd tell people with a straight face that deadheading roses had saved her marriage. She and George, who had been sleeping in separate bedrooms for years, began taking morning walks through the garden together. It was a slow mending, but it was real. Charles did not miraculously transform into a humble saint. That's not how these stories work. But he did something that surprised everyone. He asked Samuel if he could sit in on a session with the youth program. Not to help, he admitted, but to try to understand what his father saw in it. Samuel said yes. Charles came for a day, then another, and eventually became a quiet, awkward presence on Saturday mornings, handing out shovels and struggling to remember the teenagers' names. He never apologized in words, but he showed up, and showing up, for a man like Charles, was its own form of confession. The true climax, though, came 18 months after the paternity test on the anniversary of Clara's passing. Samuel had planted a stand of white lilacs, her favorite, at the edge of the Driscoll plot. George, Eleanor, and Charles all stood with him as he placed a small stone marker, engraved simply, Clara Driscoll. She grew things. After the small ceremony, George pulled Samuel aside. "I'm leaving Hadley Textiles to Charles," he said. "I want you to hear that from me. He's not perfect, but he's been trying, and the company needs him. But the estate, the land, the greenhouse, all of it is yours. Not because I'm trying to buy your forgiveness, because you're the one who will take care of it. You've been taking care of it for years without knowing why. Now you know." Samuel looked out at the lilacs. A bee moved lazily among the blossoms. "I'm not angry anymore," he said. "I was for a little while after the Dina test. I thought, he had everything, I had nothing, and it was all just a mistake. But then I read my mother's journal, and I realized she didn't see it that way. She saw me as the gift she got to keep, and she thought of you as the one who lost out, because you never got to know me. That flipped something. I've been the lucky one, George. I had her for 36 years. I had her stories, her voice, her hands in the dirt. You didn't get any of that. George's eyes filled. He didn't brush them away. He reached out and put his hand on Samuel's shoulder, a gesture that was 11 years late, and 11 years early. And then Samuel said one last thing, the thing that has stayed with everyone who knows this story. You didn't lose a son all those years ago. You gained one now. And I think that's a better trade than any of us expected. That was the moment when the quiet gardener, the man who talked to plants more than people, claimed not just his ground, but his father's heart. And Charles, watching from a distance, understood at last that his brother had inherited something he could never buy: the ability to grow things from nothing. As for the Hadley family, they learned that Dina doesn't just reveal biology, it reveals character. And sometimes, the child you never knew is the one who reminds you who you were always meant to be. There is a particular kind of quiet that follows a truth finally told. It's not the silence of absence. It's the silence of something settling into the ground where it was always meant to rest. The Hadley family discovered that silence in the months after that NA report landed on the dinner table. They discovered that blood doesn't just map biology. It maps the routes we take to avoid ourselves and the unlikely roads home we never saw coming. Think about what this story really asks of us. Not just whether a father can acknowledge a son he didn't know he had, but whether any of us are really seeing the people we pass every day. Samuel pruned roses for 11 years while his own father walked past him, offering polite nods and comments about mulch. And no one noticed the identical tilt of their heads. No one noticed the shared patience. It took a laboratory algorithm to unmask what proximity and time could not. That's the uncomfortable spine of this story. We all believe we live in clarity. We think we know who matters, who belongs, who deserves what. But the gardener you dismissed this morning might be carrying a lineage you'll only learn about on your most humbling day. And when that day comes, the measure of your character won't be how you react to winning, but how you react to discovering you've been losing something you didn't know you'd abandoned. George Hadley spent 43 years building an empire and 3 decades married to a woman he loved without fully understanding what he had buried in Millbrook. When the truth emerged, he didn't deflect. He didn't lawyer up to protect his reputation. He walked into a greenhouse, stood before a man with soil under his nails, and started the long, clumsy work of becoming a father. That's not redemption. That's just the beginning of it. Eleanor could have let resentment calcify into bitterness. Instead, she learned to deadhead roses and placed a photograph of a woman she never met on her mantle. Grace is not a feeling. It's a decision repeated until it becomes a habit. Charles took the longest arc. He tried bribery, threats, fire, and litigation. He lost every battle because he was fighting against a gravitational force he didn't understand. The truth that humility can't be outspent. In the end, he didn't surrender so much as he sat down in the dirt with his half-brother and started listening. That's not a fairy tale ending. It's an honest one. And Clara Driscoll, who wrote letters that went unopened, who stood outside a house she would never enter, who chose silence not from weakness, but from a fierce, almost holy refusal to be a weapon. She planted her son like a seed in good soil, and trusted the seasons to do what seasons do. She never got to see the white lilacs, but she knew they'd bloom someday. The world will tell you that legacy is written in wills and boardroom chairs. But what Samuel inherited was never just land. It was the quiet, steady capacity to grow things without demanding applause. That's the inheritance that endures. If you've made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. We tell stories about the moments that reshape families, the secrets that don't stay buried, and the unlikely people who teach us who we really are. And as always, thank you for being a part of this garden, because sometimes the most beautiful things bloom in the most unexpected soil.